Hi, I'm IKEA, and for today we're going to have an in-depth look at ARs, specifically on strikers, as of course ARs have been changed up quite a bit with Project Resolve and the current TU20, or Year 5, Season 3. It's been out for a week. We've had a little bit of time to adjust to it, and I've prepared some things as we're going to jump into. First, I want to say that the burst and sustain tables folder as will be linked down below as well, or most people that know me will have known them. The main file has been updated to TU20. I've still kept the PTS file in here just because that also still shows the differences made, or the changes made as it highlights them. But the burst and sustain tables have been updated with the newest numbers. And one thing I wanted to point out here, as we have the time for it, is just that also there are the tabs for other weapon types at the bottom there, as that is a frequently a question that pops up quite frequently is where are the SMG ones and such. They are the different tabs at the bottom. I've also added in MMRs now, although not with burst and sustain. But today, of course, the focus is on ARs. And one thing that I did for ARs is that we've made one big file here that says AR strikers. This is most of the weapons, not all, most of the weapons with relevant talents. So I've made a curated list because if we were to go all weapons, all talents, this list is way too long, and to me, it's also kind of needless. We have two of them, one with burst, one with sustain. Also, we have them with three different tabs. We'll go into that, and also the conceits that we're making here. But let's jump in. And let's first look at our premise and what build we're actually using. So we're using a striker here with Coyote as well. It wouldn't matter for the percentage differences that we're going to look at if it's a chest striker or an obliterate striker, because that's just a separate multiplier. A different multiplier is happening. The absolute values, the DPS flat number will change, but actually the percentage difference between the weapons that we're comparing doesn't. So it wouldn't really matter that this would hold true if this was a chest striker as well. And what we especially are doing is that, of course, on the main burst and sustain tables, if we go back to them, there are weapons here, especially the F2000, as is very relevant to this discussion, of course, which has one crit chance mod less. So if you're comparing them here at these values that they are in the burst tables, it may give the wrong impression because we have to lose 5 crit chance, and that will, of course, affect our burst. Although, of course, what we're doing especially is that if the weapon requires a different setup, we're doing that. So, for instance, here, this is all crit damages. This would be for an Elmo, for instance, which doesn't need any crit chance mods. If this was an FAMAS with 3 mods, or an ACR, or G36, or Mark 16, any of the weapons that have 3 crit chance mods available to them, 15 crit chance, we would need 1 crit chance mod in here together with the Coyote to get to 60. For F2000, for instance, or PDR, or the AKM with only 2 mods, without the muzzle, we would need 2 crit chance mods together with Cheska. So we're basically altering the build to match what we need. And that is, of course, the important part of it. If we now jump again to this, and later on we'll look at it a little bit bigger, but here first I want to talk about the decisions we're making and how they kind of affect us. Because we're going, for instance, here, as it states up there, all Coyote 15 to 25. So we're considering the Coyote numbers. The numbers have been implemented with a plus 10 crit chance, plus 10 crit damage. Everything is set to grade 25. That affects, of course, for instance, Optimist as a choice. And I do feel, though, that grade 20, at least, at the very least, or at the very least, grade 15, is available kind of to all. You can get to expertise level 16-ish quite easily nowadays. Together with that, the reductions in cost for people that were already at top expertise, getting to 25, that were 24 last season, getting to 25 isn't hard. And with the cost reductions, it is now 49 exotic components, the hard part to get for it. So it's 49 exotic components to get to grade 25, which is achievable, I would say, for especially the main weapon you're choosing to use, which this decision is basically kind of that, right? I would say, as strikers with a FAMAS, or with, in the past with a FAMAS or with the Elmo, was like the choice to go for if you needed the damage. Now we're looking at what else competes. Another conceit that we're making is that we're setting it, at least the way I'm going to discuss most of this, is 20% headshot rate and a 60% DTA rate. And we're picking those numbers as I feel those are on average what will happen. So we have to pick some numbers there. The DTA will only actually really apply to, because all of the weapons are ARs. So all of them except one has DTH as its bonus. There is the capacitor, which has DTA. The only reason is for that, because if we were to, for instance, just put in 21% and 12% as both of them being at basically their full values, the capacitor wouldn't compete really, because that's, you know, that's 12% is a lot less than 21%. I would hope everybody would know. And at a 60% rate, I feel we're comparing them on a somewhat even footing. Also 20% headshot, because headshot being additive to crit damage before it multiplies against everything else, it changes the amount of effectiveness from strained. So because of that, I'm picking 20% as my like average. Although in this as well, I've made a 0% and 100% headshot rate tabs. So at the bottom here, there is the 20%, 0%, and 100% headshot rate. And as you kind of saw there, with some likely slight flickering in the with some of the names, lengths, and stuff. Stuff does jump around because, of course, strained will become less and less amount added from the weapon talent as more headshot goes in. If you pick 0% headshot, then it's much larger. And that, of course, changes the balance between especially strained and optimist. And I consider usually strained to be the winner if it's around the 1% above optimist, because optimist does retain until you reload. So there is some effectiveness there. And because of that, for most of these weapons with 20%, I have actually gone through them and put them all into a weapon talent calculator and brought back the number for strained. That is the number that you see here. But also, if the number would have been close enough for any of them, for between strained and optimist, within 1% of each other, I would have actually put in the optimist number here. But that doesn't apply for any of the weapons here at 20% headshot rate. At 100% headshot rate, I would actually pick optimist on a bunch of weapons, actually. So there is some conceits there, but we're just going to consider them at 20%. So yeah, let's, having talked about all of the things that matter for this, let's actually look at what the results are. And yeah, that was a lot of setup, but I feel it is needed because we need to actually consider things like that, because especially when we're adding in talents, we have to say what we're picking exactly. So for instance, as well, yeah, that 20% headshot. One thing as well, there is actually two charts in here, of course, as the top one is sorted by burst. The second one is sorted by sustain, because those are both important values. I pick mostly more on burst, and I do consider sustain, because sometimes if a weapon is high enough on burst, but its sustain is very low, that can be an issue. Here as well, we're percentage-wise comparing everything to Kingbreaker as the flatline. This is indicated by this green arrow-ish kind of thing there. The reason we're doing that is I consider Kingbreaker with flatline the first weapon in here that kind of actually can achieve what it sets out. Because with, for instance, a Pyromaniac, even with a Fire Eclipse, you will likely still have enemies that, well, first don't catch on fire, like Warhounds, that you might have to shoot at, or cleaner heavies, or things like that. So you can't have a high enough uptime to consider it active at all times, basically. And for instance, here as well, as we have the two top ones, is the Chameleon, for instance, here with body active. So the effect of 90% weapon damage being active at all times, which of course doesn't happen. But this is, of course, the upper bound for the Chameleon, or the Bighorn with max stacks. Let's actually consider the Chameleon first, because it has propped up a lot. Because yeah, it does look kind of good there, right? With its buff active. But then if we try to find the other one, as we scroll down, it's all the way at the bottom of the burst tables. And this makes it its range. So of course it has other buffs. It has a reload buff. It has a crit chance buff. But we're mostly concerned about that big weapon damage buff. That is usually actually what really drives the Chameleon's power. Without any of the buffs active, it is unusably low, of course. If you can kind of keep its buffs active, which you kind of can because it retains it and resets if you go out of combat. So if you have a lot of short engagements, for instance, if you're doing territory controls or such over and over again, you have 45 seconds basically to get her done, and then you can actually keep it up at this number, but it isn't generally viable. And to me, the gap between the two is way too large to actually recommend this weapon. One other thing I should say as well, of course, that we haven't actually put up here, I realize now, is that all of the exotics have been in this chart. We're considering them as having DTOC third because, of course, damage to targets out of cover. We can now reroll them. All of the weapons kind of benefit from that. Chameleon benefits from that, going from crit chance to DTOC. Especially as well later on, we'll see Bighorn and especially as well Eagle Bearer, of course, kind of benefit a lot from that. And yeah, DTOC as well is still, as gets often asked about exotics, what should I put on it? I feel Beyonce said it best when she said, if you like it, you should put DTOC on it. And I agree with that boss lady. So yeah, DTOC on the exotics is here. And that actually drives up the Chameleon a lot. And also the Bighorn. So the Bighorn actually is one of the standouts, I feel. And especially if you can kind of make it work, you have to kind of spend some time with the Bighorn. It has a very annoying firing pattern that you kind of have to get used to. There's no going around it. But without its stacks active at a 20% headshot rate, because keep in mind, actually at a 100% headshot rate, the Bighorn is, if we actually go to it, that's for instance as well why I'm going with the 20% one. This is at the 100% headshot rate. Both of the Bighorns are at the top of the table and completely decimating everything. And that's of course because it has a headshot talent, it has a headshot bonus from a mod as well. If you're considering it at full headshots, it kind of breaks the things, and that's why we're considering it, for instance, here at 20% headshot. But still, even at 20% headshots, as we see here, it is perfectly fine and kind of actually its lower bound, which is this, without its talent fully max stacked. Although, of course, its talent basically just rotates. It just activates, you get it to full, and then starts to decay. It will decay out of combat. You can kind of keep it up if you're trying to headshot a lot. But yeah, the gap between it being off and on, basically, is pretty good because it's straddling the line of that 100% that the Kingbreaker sets here. And this will actually still might surprise some people that, so this is, of course, Kingbreaker with perfect flatline. It is a 20% amp. That because the TKB, the other TKBs or general TKB isn't in this list, as you may notice. That's because the normal TKB is basically dead to me. An ACR has more weapon damage, has the exact same rate of fire, and is a much more usable weapon. So for anything except the Kingbreaker, TKB is kind of dead in the water. But the Kingbreaker, of course, with its 20% is still at the top, but not as much ahead as it used to be, because it used to actually exceed most of the other weapons by quite a lot. A lot has caught up to it. So for instance, here as well, we have a flatline on some of the weapons that are relevant. So for instance, here, the military black market AKMs, I've tried it with flatline just to see, of course, the difference between them and the Kingbreaker, because the AKs are now very much ahead of the TKB, where it used to be the inverse, of course. But yeah, they don't catch up. So the Kingbreaker, being basically the same recoil pattern as such, is my go-to. But then we have also a few other flatlines, as we're skipping over a few of the strains. There is, of course, this G36 flatline with a really good burst. It is losing a little bit on sustain. But we also have the ACR, which is losing a little bit more than the G36 on burst versus perfect flatline, by the way. We should, because yeah, these are, of course, having normal flatline versus the Kingbreaker. This is how far behind the TKB is now, basically. But actually, the ACR sustains a lot better. For me, I will, for instance, still use Kingbreaker for Heartbreaker Tech Tank, close range builds basically, because it still has its damage output. It still has a decently good as well damage per mag. But for instance, if you're using a Red Heartbreaker, which I wouldn't really recommend at this point, but or if you want to use Flatline but you don't want to use Kingbreaker, there is now the option of both the G36, I would say, and the ACR with Flatline. Both of them handle a lot better, but lose a little bit of damage. But that is, to me, for instance, an ACR here with Flatline is perfectly fine to use. Same for G36. They're perfectly fine weapons to use for Flatline. You give up a little bit of all-out damage for a lot more usability in its recoil pattern, its accuracy. If we then move on, we're starting to get after the Flatlines, of course, because Flatline has a full active buff. Also keep in mind that I am accounting for losing a crit chance mod for the Link Laser Pointer with Flatlines. Then we start having some of the strains, and yeah, the top one is actually the AKM, because it did get an 8% buff. AKM was behind. It was behind the TKB especially, but it wasn't that far behind. And especially now with strain, with being low rate of fire as well on strikers, even it competes pretty well. So actually, AKs are actually up there in the conversation as well, except of course that they have handling issues. Because if we compare their output with strained, and we go then to the FAMAS and the F2000 as the top dogs of the category, I would consider. What we have there is that they are a little bit more than a percent and a half behind, but they're so much more easy to use. They are so much more handleable. FAMAS and F2000 are kind of head to head, especially with strained on strikers. And yes, it is with strained, because Optimist here, especially on 20% headshot, is actually more than 2% behind. And to me, it's not the consideration I would make. We'll see Shield Splinter in a second. It's a little bit more further down, because of course that is the named F2000. But what especially is the standout between them is that actually, while the FAMAS does win, on burst, on 20% headshot rate, it is by a tiny amount, and it loses by more than 10% sustain. This is the points where sustain, rears its head and makes you make different choices than what you would see. Because if you were to go off of this, the FAMAS still competes. There is another reason that actually this FAMAS still competes, where we're going to, but this sustain difference between the two will mean that the F2000, this tiny difference, after even 1.5 mags, likely, it will, rough calculation, it will be ahead of the FAMAS. So if you're in a fight and you're firing more than 1.5 mag, the F2000 will catch up, just because it's lower bound, the sustain DPS of it is so much higher than the FAMAS. So it isn't dropping as far below, and then when it comes back up after a reload, it is actually starting to get ahead and ahead and ahead, more so than a FAMAS. But the differences, of course, will still be not humongous. It's when weapons are less than 2% away from each other, you can basically pick them, and honestly, I wouldn't feel a difference under 2%, unless like actually sitting there and really like, okay, how many shots did it take to kill this red or this with this weapon or that weapon? Everything under 2%, I would say, is basically unfeelable. Now, and yeah, that will actually make me pick a lot of F2000s. I'm going to migrate a lot of my FAMASs to F2000s, because numbers-wise, yeah, it's so much better. It has a 10-round more magazine as well, and just will have... Because of that, it will also have a much better damage per mag, which is also relevant. But FAMAS has still one more thing, and that is that it is a lot more accurate, actually. So when you have the F2000, it actually jumps around when you're firing. It jumps left and right quite a bit. A FAMAS, even though it is unstable, so it has low stability and kind of like goes very high, goes into outer space, wants to go all the way to the moon, it is actually very accurate if you can compensate for that. So actually, if you recoil compensate an F2000, you will likely still miss more shots than if you can recoil compensate an FAMAS. It is harder to recoil compensate the FAMAS. That is, no one will will disagree with that, I would think. But but you definitely can, especially on Striker, which has 15 weapon handling. It is much more reliably held on target. So there is a case to be made for that way. So I would say for some cases, I would actually keep the FAMAS, especially because it will much more reasonably reach out to around the 20 meters range, where the F2000, I feel already at 15 meters, I'm not going to go for the heads. With a FAMAS, I could see myself going for a head even at 20 meters if I have to, or if I like have a pixel of an enemy because they're hiding. Next up, we have actually one of the other standouts, which is Capacitor with Technician. So this is Capacitor also with Technician. With the other weapons, we're choosing to not really concern ourselves with specialization. We're basically leaving that out. But here with Capacitor, because from Technician we can get another 7.5 weapon damage, because we basically get a yellow core, and the Capacitor turns that into a red, half of a red core. This, of course, also does stand out against, on these weapons, we could have a gunner, and we could have 5% rate of fire after the kill and the on kill. This locks you, this Capacitor plus Technician locks you into Technician, which you would want to anyway for Capacitor, I would feel. And it is quite high up here. And because of that, it is actually an interesting weapon, because while it doesn't have a damage talent, of course, it is high enough here that is in the middle of the pack of damage weapon, damage talent weapons. Although we should also consider that basically all of these other ones, you know, on the FAMAS or F2000, I could also be Demolitionist and give all my team 5 detox. I could be Survivalist and give my allies 10% damage to status affected enemies. I could be Firewall, and any enemy I'm close to will get 10% debuff on them. So there is that consideration to be made. But still, this Capacitor up here is interesting. Mostly because, as well, as you're firing it, of course, you're getting skill damage. Now, on a red build, do we really care about that? Honestly, no. Because most of the time, you're going to have a Revive Hive. You're already giving up 1 skill. Are you really going to put a drone there? Maybe a little bit more damage on an EMP sticky. But even a low drone, adding skill tiers to it, or turret, is... yeah, it is quite a bit of a loss. One thing that is the case, though, is especially if you're solo running with also Memento, there might be a case to be made there, because you could run, for instance, a Revive Hive and a turret and give it skill damage, give it skill efficiency from the Memento. The Memento, of course, is also feeding another skill tier into the mix, getting it another 7.5. So I want to kind of look at the Capacitor, but especially, for instance, for turret drone hybrids or combat medics, as I like them as well. This is actually quite the upgrade. And the big upgrade why Capacitor went up this much is that it both got a damage buff, because it's the PDR got a damage buff. It got it as well. And of course, now we can flip it to detox. So there is maybe some interesting things to do with the Capacitor, but as a general red, in a red build with just Technician, I'd pick other things, because when you're going Technician, you could also just have this G36 with Flatline. And unless you're doing something with that skill damage, and I don't think in most cases that most players would do something with it, so it's kind of a waste that way. Also as well, this is with 60% DTA, depending on if DTA goes up or down, depending on the content you're doing. So for instance, Heroic Countdown, of course, something I would have a lot more DTA, so maybe the Capacitor makes sense there. If you're playing solo and you're doing territory controls and such, most of the enemies are reds and purples, and you're basically way low on the DTA. So it's dependent on that as well, of course, because this is also the one weapon that does not get DTH as a secondary, intended as well, because it is, of course, made as a skill damage weapon, or for skill builds, basically, and some of the skills benefit from DTA. One thing as well I'll note here is that if you re-roll your Capacitor, because of a oversight at this point, you can't actually optimize the DTA roll on it, because we don't have that in our library. They made changes, of course, that we need to have the stat in our library to re-roll it. We don't have DTA for ARs because that's only relevant to the capacitor. We can't add exotic stats as well to our library anyway, so, or from exotics. So yeah, it doesn't have it, so we can't optimize it. So you have to make a conscious choice when you're re-rolling it to, once you get DTOC, whatever DTA you get, if it's very low, do you really want to re-roll it, or do you just take it with the 9 DTA or 10 DTA and just, deal with it? And of course, any loss there will propagate and pull it kind of down. Next up, some of the other mid weapons, as I would call them, like the A tier weapons, I would say. G36, ACR with strained, even the AUG is actually up here with it because it has a low fire rate as well. A fall, although actually, yeah. So we have a bunch of the strains here: PDR, P416, all of them with strain as a damage talent choice because it did more than Optimist. And all of them are actually, within a decent range. In the middle of that pack as well is the F2000 Shield Splinter. This is, of course, with the conceits that we're choosing here. With the headshot being low, it's helping strained. Although, of course, if we took 0% headshot, it would help strained even more. And we're grading at 25. If you're not grading to 25, the Shield Splinter is a perfectly fine choice. But I would consider that, this is a main damage build. Likely you're going to grade it up at least to the expertise level that you have, and for a lot of endgame players that will be 25. And the Shield Splinter does lose out to F2000 with strain. It is by a more than decent amount that I would consider, especially an F2000 with strained over Optimist. Although I will be mostly picking fast hand weapons, of course, because I love me some fast hands. But one thing I will say here as well, the Shield Splinter, of course, is a lot more consistent to get. You can just do the original base game Hunters. It'll likely at most take you 2 hours. And you're guaranteed to get a Shield Splinter. It comes with the talent. You can put DTOC there. Cassie will start selling it as well, so you might even get a better one from there if you had a horrendous drop happen. So you can very consistently get it. Where, for instance, if you're farming for a F2000 with DTOC, so you can free talent it, there's a lot of ARs in that pool. That's gonna, on average, for most people, some person might get lucky and it'll be their first drop, a god roll F2000. For most of us, it will take hours upon hours. So there's definitely a case there. Also, the Descent blueprints now contain the Shield Splinter as well, Hunter Killer as well, actually. So you can actually get it from there as well. Although, of course, if you aren't basically close to having all of them, it might take you a while because it is still expensive, of course, unless you had saved up a lot and are getting reconstructed caches now. Next up, we have the Eagle. And the EB, of course, got 2 buffs basically with the changes. One being that it is considered a P416 and it got its RPM as well. So its RPM went up, and of course now it can roll DTOC as well. And that's also how we're considering it here, is with DTOC. You may notice that both the Eagle and Elmo are kind of close to each other and down here. This might give a little bit of a warped view because as well these are always active on their damage. Of course, strained, one of the conceits of strained is that we're considering it here as if we're always unloading all the way to empty and then reloading and then unloading all the way to empty. That's of course not how it plays out in the game. Especially with strained, the calculation is there to mostly compare strained versus Optimist because they play pretty much the same. But actually as well, also the case for the capacitor as well, kind of, is that they're always active from the first shot. So especially if you're just firing like 6-7 shots against a red and killing them and they're dead, something like Elmo and Eagle actually compare. So these are the conceits that we kind of have to make and just discuss on a gameplay level, that they're kind of different, because even if you're just only shooting a few times, an Eagle or an Elmo then come out ahead. Although, of course, we have the flatline weapons, which also with the pulse from Technician, they will also do their damage from the first shot. So the flatlines are always there as also a comparison point. But the Eagle actually looks decently good, especially on strikers here. And the Eagle solo is actually in my recommended list. It is, I would consider it actually one of the S tier weapons. I would consider the S tiers to be FAMAS, F2000, Elmo, and Eagle. Eagle, especially solo. So Eagle is one of the more interesting ones because it has tenacity. It can't have a damage talent, but it's high enough in there that it is comparing decently well with some of the other weapons, especially if we kind of, consider that strain is more of a theoretical. And because of that, it is actually pretty powerful. And tenacity solo, you can definitely make it work. It will get you killed here and there once in a while. Eagle is famous for killing as many enemies. For any 100 enemies that you kill, it will kill you once, basically, I feel. That ratio might be higher if you're starting out. But once you get the hang of it, tenacity, especially solo, where you're getting a kill, all the kills, it is basically an on-kill talent, of course. So it works better solo where you're not competing with anybody else for the kills. But numbers-wise, it makes decently well sense. It is, of course, a little bit jumpy, kind of the same issue that Bighorn has. Less so than the Bighorn. You can kind of keep it on target, but yeah, it is kind of rough because of that. And then, of course, we have the Elmo, a little bit below it. That is still, as well, a really high pick, because while it doesn't compare on the damage talent-wise, it is always active from the first shot. Its buffs are mostly coming from its high base and also having... or decent base, and having those crit chance, crit damage mods, that's 20, 20, and 20. Those add up, and yeah, it still competes. And also, I would say, especially because if we compare, for instance, all the way from the FAMAS with Strain at 97% of the Kingbreaker, down to the Elmo, which is like here at 93%, they're within 4% of each other. A meaningful difference, but also not a completely game-breaking difference between them. Elmo, I feel, yeah, I'm still putting it in my S tier. Here we also have the capacitor without Technician, comparing kind of favorably with them. So actually, yeah, the capacitor is very much up in there. And that's mostly down as well to its 10 crit chance, 30 crit damage mods. That 30 crit damage is a lot. And to me, actually, this might be a little bit overtuned. I might give it just the 5 weapon damage, but I don't know if they might consider stuff like that. One actually we skipped over here that I see now is the AUG with Invisible Hand. The Invisible Hand, of course, is a 12 rate of fire. And because of that, it is actually pretty powerful. And it's also, of course, always active. So it is actually kind of comparable to the Flatlines, but of course not locking you into having to use Technician. So, but the AUG jumps around way too much. It is a horrendous base weapon. That's why I also just wanted to bring it up, but yeah, it's not going to be recommended. Then, of course, also we are going to go into, the set of weapons that didn't get a buff. The M4 with Strain, the CTAR with Strain, and the Carbine 7 with Strain are basically on par, or well, let's say 2% ahead of a FAMAS with Fast Hands. A FAMAS with Fast Hands is, of course, Fast Hands isn't feeding into burst at all. It is a sustain talent. To me, also, it is a utility talent, because what more matters to me than the sustain of Fast Hand is the ability to just keep firing, having the ability to control that when you need to reload, you can, and get shooting again, because you might stagger the enemy, you might kill them. It saves you a lot more often than most people would think. But M4 and the Carbine 7 especially, the CTAR got a magazine buff, which, yeah, didn't do enough. Together with the rail splinter, I definitely basically would avoid the weapon. M4 and Carbine for now as well. They might buff this, of course, in the future. Project Resolve is an ongoing thing, so maybe in the future they'll give it... the Carbine 7 and M4 could definitely use like a 7% weapon damage buff. And yeah, they are pretty far behind. And them just being barely ahead of the Fast Hands FAMAS, I would just pick the Fast Hands FAMAS, have barely less burst, and then have a humongously higher sustain. they really need their buffs, basically. They need something done to them. Same for the SIG, actually, and same for the TKB, actually, as well. That's why they are not in this list. The SIG and the TKB aren't, except that the SIG is in here just for mechanical animal, with mechanical animal as his talent. We'll reach that in a second. But yeah, we have then the fast hands ones. And one of the standouts here as well is actually the black market AKM. We'll go actually into sustain for the fast hands ones. We'll compare them on that because while this list on burst kind of matters, they're all within basically a few percent of each other, 4%-ish if we go. Well, actually, if we go to the Mark 16, it's within 5.6% of each other is that range from the FAMAS all the way down with fast hands. So the fast hands weapons are pretty close to each other, so we kind of have to, the sustain will matter a bit for them. Again, as well, though, the M4 and Carbine with fast hands and such are way behind the rest with fast hands. The SIG, the mechanical animal. I want to love the mechanical animal. It future perfection, having 4 skill tiers now that it adds with 4 kills. Seems great, but the base weapon just doesn't work well enough. To the point that I would actually just take that extra, because if we compare this basically to a FAMAS with fast hands that doesn't have a damage talent either. We're not comparing them on the sustain, but just on their burst, basically utility talent versus utility talent that isn't affecting burst at all. This being close to 9% behind, no, 8-point-something% behind, I'd lose the red core and just grab a yellow core. That's less of a loss than and taking a FAMAS or an F2000 or a black market AKM with future perfect, the normal variant, and having 1 more yellow core over this SIG. And yeah, it ends out with the chameleon without any buffs on at the bottom, as expected, of course, but by a large margin. That's also what kind of still kills the chameleon. Let's move on to sustain. And for sustain, we're gonna scroll down a bit. There's a second table basically for sustain. We're gonna be a lot briefer than with the burst, because the burst to me usually matters more than sustain. Sustain is something, sustain and damage per mag are both things that I will consider if a weapon is high enough on burst. So for instance, especially with the consideration of the FAMAS and the F2000 next to each other, the FAMAS having a much lower sustain than the F2000 because of that 10 round difference, because of the reload differences as well between them. I will pick the F2000 because it's what you have to see burst and sustain as. Burst is the upper bound of theoretical damage. Sustain is the lower bound of theoretical damage. So the theoretical damage happens in between them. DPS as a whole is a theoretical damage. If the lower bound is high enough above the other one, the amount you drop off and how fast you drop off will be less. Because of that, after a few mags, a weapon like the F2000 will actually start beating a FAMAS. Mostly because it's also, the FAMAS isn't that much ahead. Because if we actually look here at the sustains, here again as well, we have actually the black market AKMs as the top in the sustain chart. A little bit ahead of the AKM without that extra mod for it. So it has to make up for 1 mod, although it has a higher base. Then the ACR, which has a standout actually as well in being really decently good in burst and sustain, while being basically the first weapon in the burst and sustain both that is very handleable. So for instance, the G36 as well kind of is in that range as well. But of course, actually the F2000 being all the way up here, where the FAMAS is all the way, what's sorting like this? F2000 is all the way up here, the FAMAS is all the way down there. 3% difference between them versus the top dog in the AKM and the black market AKM. This will make me pick F2000s because they are just basically head-to-head anyway. And then the F2000 just sustains so much better. That 60 round mag as well will make it so that that enemy you left on a sliver with a FAMAS isn't an enemy that stayed alive with an F2000 because you killed him. because you had 10 more rounds to kill him with. Those kind of things matter. And yeah, it's kind of sad for the FAMAs, but the more I've looked at this chart, I've gone like, I'm really going to start replacing a lot of FAMASs with F2000s. As well, another standout in here as well is that, yeah, the Elmo, of course, with its 70 round mag is very much high in sustain. Same for the Bighorn, again, is very competitive on sustain and was already, of course, competitive on burst as well. That makes it a standout as well, especially the Bighorn. This is, of course, Bighorn at max stacks, but the Bighorn without max stacks is... it's a little bit down, actually. It's not even on there, but yeah, it's there-ish. So it is a much larger gap on sustain when it doesn't have its max stacks, because it's from all the way up there to all the way down here. That is but that's still fine because it was so high on burst. So the Bighorn, I feel, is actually one of the standout weapons here. I would still put it as A tier and not S tier just because it is so horrendous to use. You will know what I mean if you use it for like 3 minutes and go like, oh yeah, this thing is incredibly hard to keep on target. So that's a big downside. Sustain-wise, yeah, the expected happens here, which is that the fast hands weapons are all at the top, especially the ones with really long reloads benefit the most from it, especially, for instance, like the AKMs. Here, the ACR being also a slow firer benefits a lot from it as well. And also, yeah, so here even the Chameleon with the max or with the body active at all times, the plus 90 weapon damage, is actually pretty far down this list. And this is kind of the reason as well why I do pick Fast Hands. Fast Hands as well has the utility of saving your life quite often. You will, if you kind of look at your own footage over time, you will notice that most of the times that you're dying, or a lot of the times that you're dying in reloads because you don't have the agency at that point to shoot them and stagger them, or shoot them in a weak point, or try to, you know, get some, or just outright kill the enemy that is trying to kill you. To me, Fast Hands is one of the best talents, and I would recommend everybody to at least try it out if you haven't ever. And one thing as well, so here we have actually the Fast Hands CTAR and the Fast Hands were M4 and Carbine. Oh, actually, they're way lower than I expected. So yeah, they get gobbled up by strained weapons, where all of the other Fast Hands are kind of together. M4 and Carbine are kind of dead in the water for now for me. And yeah, keep them, hang on to them, don't delete them yet. Changes, you know, future changes can always happen. We don't know what's if they have more planned. Between PTS 1 and 2, they added in a bunch of weapons. They didn't add in any more weapons going into the live game, but there's always, you know, 20.1, 20.2, 20.3, 20.4, and likely, you know, even more seasons as we go into year 6 coming up after this season. There are no other real standouts here except as well that, yeah, Eagle is still doing decently well. Capacitor, so this is one of the reasons as well where the Capacitor kind of loses it for me, is that, yeah, while it is decently high on the burst, it is terribly far behind on the sustain, because it isn't gobbled up in the pack of like Fast Hands, or like the Elmo being all the way up here still, or the Eagle being a little bit higher than the Elmo, for instance, on burst, but now losing on sustain. The Capacitor was a little bit ahead of the rest, and now it's a lot behind on sustain. And that's, of course, down to its 41-round magazine. Even though it has a really nice fast reload, that 41-round magazine really does hurt it. You would and this is, of course, with Technician as well. So with the rest of these weapons, we could have had, yeah, Gunner giving us some rate of fire on kill or something like that. This is going all in on the Capacitor, and it's still not competing that well. This is, of course, with 60% DTA as well, to try to give it a little bit of a leg up. But yeah, I want it to be good, but it sadly isn't. And yeah, as we go down to the end of it, SIG is, of course, the lowest burst weapon. Currently, it is very much at like the end of the lists on the burst and sustain tables. that kind of kills the mechanical animal for me. The chameleon without buffs, of course, as well is a very very low. This is why the chameleon will always kind of be a niche weapon. It's okay, but not when it doesn't have its buff. It's too horrendous when it doesn't have its buff. It's really nice when it does, but it just doesn't have them often enough. So yeah, we've reached the end of this. This, of course, all will be linked down below, so you can go have a look at your own leisure. I might actually add in other weapons or such if there's a requester. Feel free to request them. I feel, as we did these on stream, a few weapons popped up there that we added in as we went along. But of course, this is also up for updates if need be. Also, if you catch any errors, although I feel we've gone through it pretty well at this point, and caught most of the errors that I made. But if you still catch any errors, feel free to come forward with that, and we'll get those fixed up, as these files will continue to live in the burst and sustain tables folder for quite a while, I feel. As I feel this is much better of a way of trying to understand which weapon picks we want to make. And yeah, for me especially, the FT1000 is the big winner here, and very much a weapon that is well worth using. So yeah, let's jump to our conclusion. And yeah, to give the final conclusions, we'll go actually over some of the things. So Capacitor is a standout, Bighorn is a standout, Eagle is still good, Elmo is still good, Chameleon is meh. All of them would be considered with DTOC, which I don't have on all of these weapons. ACR, especially the ACR-E, I would recommend the ACR-E over the ACR, as between them, there's a quite difference within their stability and accuracy. The ACR-E is much easier to use. The AKMs are good. The AUG is pretty bad just because it jumps around and is a mid-tier one. Carbine is kind of dead in the water. CTAR is also kind of dead in the water, as it didn't get good enough of a buff. P416s are very competitive now, but I would still pick an ACR-E or an G36 over it. FT1000s are the biggest winner, especially for me. And fast stance, FT1000 will replace a bunch of my FAMASs with fast stance. The Fulls didn't get enough of a buff to matter. The FAMASs are still good, especially, for instance, if you have a grade 24, or no, this will become a grade 25 in a few hours. Because the accuracy is still there, it is a little bit better on its accuracy than the FT1000. But I'll still replace a bunch of them with FT1000s. G36 are pretty good, especially if you need flatline, which the G36E and military can provide. The G36C can't. And I would definitely recommend the E over as the variant. Honey Badger didn't get good enough of a buff, kind of is dead in the water like the Carbine 7, its bigger brother is. Invisible Hand and the AUGs are, yeah, they jump around way too much. And if you're going to pick an AUG, the Invisible Hand is the go-to for it, I would say. Actually, this 12% is, of course, additive to the 15 on Striker. So on Strikers, it's actually at its worst, and it was kind of in the middle of all of the strained weapons. So it is okay on its damage, just not on its handleability. TKBs, except for the Kingbreaker, as is here, are kind of dead. They are less weapon damage than an ACR, the same RPM. An ACR-E especially is so much more handleable than a TKB. The Kingbreaker, though, is still a standout weapon because of that 20% that it has for its perfect talent. And it can still be usable. I will definitely still keep using them on Heartbreak Attack Tanks, but TKBs are getting replaced with AKs or ACRs for me. On the builds that I use them, for instance, on Ongoing Directive for Sadist weapons. SIG and Mechanical Animal not getting any buffs. They really need it. They might get it in the future. That makes kind of Mechanical Animal not useful to me either. Yeah, the military AKMs are worse than the black market AKMs, but still a decent pick if you have a good one. Military G36 is a worse version than a G36E to me, but still well worth using. And the P416, as again, I would pick the custom over the military, but of course, if you have a good military, just use that. The Mark 16s did get a buff, but to me, not good enough to compete with other weapons. They are a little bit more accurate than the ACRE or G36, but the damage loss is too big for me. PDR did get a buff and is kind of at the top end, but it kind of is just a worse F2000 to me in use as well with its characteristics. So I would just pick an F2000 over this. But if you get a really good one, it is actually not that far behind an F2000. The Police M4s and the Pyromaniac with it, the Police M4s just didn't get a buff, and because of that, they're kind of dead in the water at this point. They're way far down on burst and sustain, making it a bad choice, basically. Hopefully they will alter that, because I have a grade 21 here, and with flatline, they were always good for flatline. Hopefully they still get a buff. Shield Splinter is also one of the easy standouts. F2000 is really good. Perfect Optimist is good enough to use versus Strained. And it is, of course, very consistent to get. Not per se easy. It'll take you 2 hours. But at least if you get it done, you know you will get this weapon. Farming an F2000 will be a lot harder than this for most people unless you get lucky. So well worth considering. Also, maybe if you do a lot of descent, you might get the blueprint. So there's that. Yeah, Sig's didn't get a buff, so dead in the water. The SOCOMs and the SOCOM Mark 16 and the Tactical Mark 16 are kind of like the other Mark 16. It kind of didn't get big enough of a buff to really matter. The test subject, while not in that list, just because I didn't want to include it at its full strength, it is a decent choice, but actually I would pick the capacitor over it, especially because you can get from Technician, you can get that 7.5 weapon damage. Because of that, it's kind of a non-item to me. And yeah, TKB, of course, as we talked about, didn't get a buff. And at this point, if you want to use a similar weapon to this, you can go with the AKs. So for instance, I do use fast stance TKBs, as they had a really high sustain with a decent enough damage. For mid-range, they were actually competitive in that, especially for damage per mag and ammo conservation. Those are all getting replaced, or with Sadist as well for ongoing directive with a high damage per mag. All of them are getting replaced with either AKMs, black market AKMs specifically, or ACRs, because the ACR is just ahead of it at this point. But hopefully, maybe in the future, it will still get a buff. So yeah, we went through all of the ARs. I hope it wasn't too long or too boring and too rambly as we took our first in-depth look. And this will be actually a newer series that I will sometimes name some of these as in-depth looks, as even though they're rambling, they're a little bit more than that. So I want to kind of name them a little bit different. We'll have other ones like these coming out right up. Next one up is going to be LMGs with kind of the same layout. SMGs, of course. We're also going to do MMRs, but mostly just first shot and highest hit on a hot shot build. Both the Chainkiller Aroldi variant and the Habsburg variant. Just because I'm interested in those numbers, because most of these that I make them, they're also for my own use to come to decisions, because I was considering actually keeping more FAMASs than I was going to. This list showed me that, yes, that's not viable. And yeah, even the standouts like the capacitor and also like seeing the Eagle in its place and Elmo is, yeah, very informative, I feel. So those will be coming up. And yeah, if you enjoyed this video, if you can help me out with the algorithm, you know the ways. I won't say them out loud. Yeah, we'll come back in a few days with the LMG one next up. And as always, have a good night.